We all must search. We must search for what is truth.
What is truth?
Truth is
just that's a really hard question. What is truth?
There has to be a fixed truth, in my opinion, for the universe to function properly.
What is truth?
And the lonely voice of youth cries, what is truth?
And the truth shall set you free!
Hello and welcome to What is Truth? I am your host, Dave Glander. I'm WIMO 1300. I hope you're having a good new year. We are going to blow this show up, actually. The suppression of truth has gone forth so strongly, just based upon not trying to show the evidences that I think are there. And so I wanted to talk with my first guest, who's Dr. Aaron Judkins. And then as I was kind of doing my last minute show notes today before I drove over here to the studio, I was doing some research and came across a man named Dr. Jerry Bergman, who's actually written a book, and he's going to be our second guest on today for kind of a panel discussion on something. I believe I've got it. Aaron, do I have you on the line?
Yes, sir, Dave. I'm here.
Aaron, how are you doing? Go ahead, Brother
well,
E, if you go ahead and get Dr. Bergman on the line as well from the 5482 number, that'd be perfect. Let me go ahead and introduce Aaron while I've got him on here. We're very disorganized. Maybe this year. Well, you know what it is? It's foggy outside and gray. The Falcons got their butts handed to them today. It's just been one of those days. And so I guess I'm still having one of those days right now. Dr. Aaron Judkins is the author, explorer, and biblical archaeologist from Dallas, Texas. He has a passion for searching for the truth and mysteries of the past, which he actually airs on his internet show, Man vs. Archaeology. I would highly suggest going and looking that up. It's phenomenal stuff. He has studied the human fossil footprint phenomenon for 15 years. He's credited with mapping the longest contiguous dinosaur trackway in the Western Hemisphere near Glen Rose, Texas, in the year 2000. That's actually a huge accreditation to you. He's participated in numerous excavations throughout the U.S. and Israel, ranging from 15 different dinosaur digs, the Pool of Siloam in 2004, in Jerusalem, the Tower of Siloam, and 2008. He's been featured on TBN's Creation in the 21st Century. He has his PhD in biblical archaeology, so he is our first guest. And today on the show as well, we've got Dr. Jerry Bergman, who is Dr. Bergman. Are you on with us?
Yes, I am.
Very good. Dr. Bergman, thank you so much for coming. It was about 20 minutes ago that I called him and I said, hey, doing some research, I see that you wrote a book that actually is very pertinent to our discussion, and he's agreed to come on at the last second. He has taught biology, genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, anthropology, geology, and microbiology at the Northwest State Community College in Archbold, Ohio for over 17 years. He's now completing his ninth degree. Ninth degree, Dr. Bergman?
Well, that's completed now, actually.
That's actually completed. This is an old bio. Are you going for your 10th now?
Well, no, I kind of think I spend my time doing writing now.
That is phenomenal. I was going to say we're going to have one of those shows about kind of like the 20 kids and counting. You could be 10 degrees and counting or something. He is a graduate of Medical College of Ohio. He has over 600 publications in 12 languages and 20 books and monographs. The book that caught my attention today is called The Slaughter of Descendants, which exposes how careers of Darwin skeptics have been brutally attacked and destroyed in many academic institutions throughout America. Dr. Bergman, that's what I want to do is have a just go ahead and do that or something. What I want to do today is have a panel discussion between me and yourself and Dr. Aaron Judkins, who is also on with us. What kind of got me started with this is, as I said, we're going to be covering the X-Files of Christianity in the month of January. And what makes those X-Files is because nobody actually talks about them. And so I wanted to kind of go, well, why isn't anybody talking about them? Why is all this evidence there and nobody's really addressing it? And I went back this morning and rewatched Ben Stein's movie Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, and I just wrote down a few here, and then I want to Dr. Bergman, if you could address that for us a little bit more. But the first one he addressed was Dr. Richard Sternberg, who is the editor of Science Journal of the Smithsonian Museum of Evolutionary History, who was fired for publishing an article that Dr. Stephen Meyer, which is one of the leaders in the ID movement, his religious and political background was investigated, and he was actually labeled as an intellectual terrorist just for simply publishing an article that was a peer-reviewed article, by the way, from Stephen Meyer. Dr. Carolina Crocker was a professor of cell biology at George Mason University, and she simply mentioned ID in a class. She was disciplined and fired at the end of the semester and blacklisted from the academic community. She said she gets lots of job interviews, but she can no longer get a job actually in her field because she's been blacklisted. Dr. Michael Egner was the neurosurgeon at Columbia University, wrote an essay saying that doctors didn't need to study evolution in order to practice medicine, and for doing so, he was the subject of Darwinist attacks with nasty comments. Suggested a rash of calls to the university, which was forced him to retire. Dr. Guillermo Gonzalez was a professor of astronomy at Iowa State University. He actually discovered several planets. This guy was smart. He published a book called The Privileged Planet, and his application for tenure was denied, putting his career in jeopardy. And he said this very interesting comment. He said, if you value your careers, you should keep quiet about your ID views.
That's true.
And then finally, I saw actually in Dr. Bergman's book, Rodney LeVake. Could you speak to us, Dr. Bergman, about what you documented 300 cases?
Yeah, and that's volume 1, and I have 4 volumes that are coming out hopefully soon.
4 volumes.
Basically, what happens when you quote deny Darwin or doubt Darwin is it ends your career.
Oh my goodness!
Many cases.
Why? I mean, that's got to be the first.
Well, the main reason why is when you present both sides of the creation-evolution question, when you present the evidence for design as versus the evidence for evolution, Darwinism, from, as they say, from the goo to you by way of the zoo, or from molecules to man, it's very difficult for evolution to compete simply because you don't have the evidence. So when you present both sides, specifically the evidence against evolution and then the evidence for evolution, students invariably will realize that they simply don't have the evidence, and therefore Darwinists, to maintain their theory, basically eliminate one side. They only want to present one side because they realize if they present both sides, they're going to lose.
And it begs the question, what does academia have to lose if they allowed the subject of intelligent design in the classroom? Well, what is it that they're afraid of?
They're afraid of losing the so-called war between theism and atheism. And therefore, the way they can win it is to prevent the other side from presenting their side. You know, it's the old story of censorship going way back in history. You prevent the other side from presenting their views, and that way you win.
Who's at the top of this? I mean, who's at the top of this as far as putting the snuff on the entire ID evidence? I mean, because at the end of the day, it comes down to evidence. And so I guess the first thing you would have to examine, which I think we could do at a different episode, is there evidence for ID? And for the sake of this show, let's just go ahead and say there's overwhelming evidence for ID, for intelligent design. So right. Who is at the top of this, really putting the brakes on the evidence coming into light for examination?
Well, it's not really someone at the top of it. There is basically, in the past 50 or 60 years, only one side has been presented. So therefore, a large number of scientists accept the one side because that's the only side they're aware of.
In Ben Stein's movie, he was actually saying that if you say something about it in the academic community, you're blacklisted. I'm sure in your research you've realized that is that a true statement? Because I did see a website that said exposed, and they were trying to discredit everything that Ben Stein had brought up. In your research, what have you seen as far as the silencing of the intelligent design movement?
Well, I've seen without a doubt they're trying to silence not just the intelligent design movement, but those who are critical of Darwinism. And the website Exposed is really dishonest and naive. They really haven't done their research, and they come up with false reasons. For example, they say Carolyn Crocker was let go because her contract expired. Well, that's not true at all. And she documented that actually in her book, which she wrote called Free to Think. which is available on Amazon and other places, and she in detail has photocopies of documentations showing that simply is not true. And so if you spend the time looking into these cases, as I have and as others have and Ben Stein has, then you can see that indeed they are blacklisted. And there's no shortage of cases. In fact, there's so many I really can't keep up with them. One case, a gas scale case, by the way, the documents in that case are about 3 feet high. So you're talking about enormous amount of evidence, and this was the University of Kentucky, and they basically said, we cannot hire this man, even though he's clearly the most qualified person for the position, because he may lend credibility to the arguments against Darwinism. And they were very open about this. It came out in the depositions very clearly. And they also subpoenaed emails in which actually they got the main evidence for the case, which did go to court, and the university settled out of court. I think they gave them $110,000.
Wow.
Basically to go away. So, and that case, we had overwhelming evidence at the University of Kentucky that indeed they discriminated against this man specifically because of his doubts about Darwin. They found out about that, by the way, by doing a website search.
Really?
And once they found out that he had questions about Darwinism, they said, we can't hire him. He was looking at a position in the astronomy department, and the biology department is the area that objected to his being hired. So what he was teaching and what he was doing research in was totally different than biological evolution. But yet the biologist could not stomach hiring someone in the university anywhere who questioned what they feel is the fact of Darwinism.
Is there some sort of an unspoken rule, or is this a written down rule in the science community?
It's written down now. In the past, well, actually it's been in the past as well. If you read the journals and so on, they say people who question Darwinism have no right to mislead.
Are you kidding me?
Young minds. Oh, yeah, it's very, very, very open.
And it's all under the guise of trying to attach an intelligent designer to the creationist movement, which in my personal opinion, and I believe that's the opinion of the ID movement, is they're not necessarily they're mutually exclusive as far as they can be separated. I know a lot of Jewish scholars, academic scholars who are not Christian in any way, shape, or fashion, who are huge proponents of the intelligent design movement. Is that what they're trying to? Is that how they're stopping it in court, per se? I mean, if a case goes before court, because I know that Mr. LeVaque's case actually went and he appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court and was refused to hear the case.
Right.
Why would they refuse to hear a case?
Well, that's because the Supreme Court may get 3,000 cases, and they select from those maybe 20 or 30. And so they're very selective, and they vote basically to determine which cases will be heard. And 3 judges may want to hear the case, but it's not enough to get the case actually heard.
Uh-huh.
So
and I suppose it's really not a big deal to them, a little case of a high school teacher trying to mention the flaws within evolution.
Right. To them, it's just, there are like all of other cases that are a lot more important. So.
Oh, my goodness. What do you think the future... What is I guess it's a hard question to ask. What do you see the future being for the intelligent design movement? Is it just going to be something that's never heard? Is the evolutionist scientific community finally coming to grips with the fact that there's so many flaws that maybe they should allow for the ID movement? Or what is the future of this?
I think the ID movement will grow. It's growing not just in this country, but also internationally. And there are more and more scientists that are in favor of looking at this worldview. And it's going to come to a point where I think where the evolutionists can no longer hold it back, where the overwhelming evidence will occur, discovered by evolutionists themselves, that indeed Darwinism is not true and it never occurred, it never could occur, and that conclusion is a result of science.
Well, there was one guy whose face was blacked out during the Ben Stein's movie, and so I listed him as anonymous, but he quoted, "You can use your intelligent design to get your research done, but you're not allowed to talk about it in public." Is that kind of where you see it going at this point? Is more scientists behind the scenes are discovering that intelligent design is a very viable solution to a lot of the problems with abiogenesis in particular, but they're not allowed to actually say it in a classroom or an academic setting?
they have to be careful. They have to be very circumspect, and they also have to realize that they've got to worry about their family, their career, and when I speak, and I speak quite a bit about this subject, I basically say, if you want to survive in your career, you've got to stay in the closet, because if you get out of the closet, you're likely going to have problems. Not everywhere. There are a few who survive, but by and large, the vast majority, probably about 90%, have problems, especially if they're open about what they believe, and if they end up on TV or doing articles in newspapers and so on, then they end up with problems.
Even if they denounce the Christian faith, meaning they're of a different faith, let's say they're a Muslim scientist, even if they denounce the Christian agenda, if you will, they're still blacklisted?
Oh, yeah. It's,
my goodness.
It's quite an interesting situation, somewhat unheard of.
I mean, would you call this I hate the word conspiracy because it's attached to so many different things that people don't like, but it sounds to me like it's a conspiracy to suppress the truth of intelligent design. Would you go as far as to say that's a good description?
That, in essence, is what has happened, but I don't think there's a bunch of people there plotting to prevent the presentation of intelligent design in the schools, but there are a lot of people who believe that it shouldn't be presented. They publish articles, people read these articles, and therefore they're convinced of this idea.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get articles published in journals which present the opposite idea. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult.
My goodness.
And a lot of us feel you're wasting your time sending an article which supports intelligent design to a journal, because chances are very, very high that it'll be rejected. And you know why? Why waste the time? Why not go on and do your research in other areas or publish your articles in journals that are receptive, such as some certain Christian journals.
So really, it just comes down to a matter of whether or not you want to protect your career. I mean, I guess that in and of itself is the very definition of worldview. And when somebody's worldview is I can put food on the table, or I can present an evidence that leans towards ID, they choose the latter.
Yeah, or some retire and then do the research or publish in the area of ID, but it's a problem. And
wow,
there needs to be more attention to this, especially, ironically, in some ways it's worse at Christian colleges, because they want to be seen as respectable, and they realize if they favor or support ID or creation, that's going to affect their respectability.
At a Christian college?
At Christian colleges. For example, my book, The Dark Side of Darwin, which has done pretty well, it's been out for less than a year, and it's sold almost 5,000 copies, which in the publishing world is pretty good.
That's great.
World bestseller, but 5,000 copies is not bad for about a year. And a friend of mine gave a copy to Wheaton College Library, and they refused to put it in the library. And so, and you get this over and over.
Well, I guess I'm confused about what would be the agenda of is the Christian college at large not in full support of creationism one way or the other, whether it's a long earth, old earth, but it denounces theistic evolution on the mainstream level, yes?
Well, most Christian colleges, unfortunately, have what they call a veneer of Christianity left.
Oh, boy.
And now there's some that are very supportive, but not many. Probably 24 that are very supportive.
Yeah.
But the rest of the schools they're concerned about their reputation in the scientific community, and therefore they're concerned about allowing any doubts about Darwin to creep in their staff. And Wheaton does have one professor who's very supportive of ID, and he wrote a book, Prattle Pun, his name is, and he wrote an excellent book, but there's not many there, and there's one short-age creationist there that I know of, and one long-age creationist. Doctor.
My goodness, that is, folks, if you're listening and you're not alarmed by this, wake up. I mean, this is the more I started to research this, the more I was blown away at the fact that people just are not standing up to this whatsoever. We're just kind of allowing our faith to be taken hostage by whatever idea suits the majority at large, and I just cannot believe that. Dr. Bergman, would you tell us how people can get a hold of your books before I let you go? Oh, I think maybe did I lose them already? Aaron, are you on the line?
I'm on the line, Dave.
Somehow we must have lost. Oh yeah, kill that. Yeah, somehow we lost Dr. Bergman. He well, I do know this much. Dr. Bergman's books, I believe, are listed at. You can try and call him back, see if you can get him. I'm not sure what happened there. I know his books are listed on Answers in Genesis website. I believe he's one of their, I guess you could say, subcontracted speakers at Answers in Genesis. And there is several books that he's got. The book that we had him on to talk about is called Slaughter of Descendants. And I myself am going to buy the book. I didn't know it existed up until about an hour ago, and called him up, and he was kind enough to come on. Aaron, you have had Aaron Judkins has become a friend of mine. He has undergone his own personal story, I guess you could say, and that's kind of where I want to go. I think we're going to get Dr. Bergman on just to close it up because I'm not sure what happened to him. But Aaron, I want you to tell us about what you've personally undergone. Dr. Bergman, are you back on?
Yep, I'm back on.
Yeah,
Sorry, we had a
quite all right.
problem.
Somehow or another, we lost you. I was asking you, could you tell our listeners where we could get your publications? What's the best place to go to do that?
Well, any Christian bookstore will have them, or Amazon.com has the Slaughter of the Dissidents, and also has the Dark Side of Charles Darwin.
Okay.
And the other books that I've written. I have another book I'm working on now, actually, as you called earlier. I was working on it, called Hitler's Darwinian Disciples.
Wow.
And
we may need to keep you on to the end of the show. That's actually where I'm going with this at the end of the show.
Well, what I've done is I've documented that most of the major leaders in Nazi Germany were clearly Darwinists and clearly anti-Christian, and made it very clear in their writings where they stood in these two areas. And I'm having a couple of PhD-level historians who are experts on the history of Nazi Germany review it. And so I was just going through the reviews as when you called earlier.
That is, I mean, if you're not doing anything and you want to hang out on the line,
Sure.
I'm going to talk with Dr. Judkins here for a little while. I've heard some of his personal stories of the show title today is kind of the Suppression of Truth, and Dr. Judkins has some pretty amazing stories that I was really taken back by when he told them. But actually, when we finish up with Dr. Judkins' stories, that's actually kind of how I'm closing out the show, is going into once the agenda of the denial of the intelligent design movement goes forth, what's the real agenda here, and what does that allow for? And I was actually going to tie it into Hitler and the Holocaust, and say that's kind of, we'll get into that if you want to hang on the line.
Okay, sure.
By golly, that's kind of funny. God has a very good sense of humor, because that's actually right where we're going towards the end of the show to sum it up. So we'll keep you on there, Aaron.
Okay.
I was talking about Aaron as a good friend of mine. We were out in Glen Rose, Texas. So when I met him, and he was telling me some stories that I want him to relate to us tonight. And then he's actually going to be our guest on next week, as we really tonight I want to talk about the suppression of truth, and next week we're going to start getting into the evidence that I'm talking about. And he happens to be, as far as I'm concerned, one of the leading experts in the world on the human fossil footprint phenomenon globally, and just also an extremely informative person when it comes to the existence of dinosaurs and man living together with different artwork through history and stuff. But Aaron, I remember one of the biggest stories that hit me that you told us was when you went to Egypt. Could you tell me what happened when you went to the museum in Egypt?
Well, Dave, when I was in Egypt in 2008, I was doing some research, and I went to the Cairo Museum, and there's a particular artifact that I requested to see. I knew it was there. It was found at Thebes. It's the Mernontos Stela. And I knew that they had moved it from Thebes to the Cairo Museum.
How did you know that? Just so we can clarify that it was there. How did you know that?
Well, through research that I have done on the artifact itself, it's documented that they moved it to Cairo, and they readily admit that it's at the museum.
Okay.
So there's no secret that it's at the Cairo Museum.
Okay.
But the particular reason that I wanted to see it is because it's the first artifact outside the Bible that references the name of Israel, the ancient name of Israel, outside the Bible. And this is, of course, in hieroglyphics.
And why is that important to our topic tonight?
Well, because there's such a suppression of ancient Israel being in the land of Egypt, according to the biblical text. And so secular archaeologists and even biblical archaeologists in the area that are what they call biblical minimalists deny the very true account of the biblical history of ancient Israel being in Egypt. And so this is the Myrnitol stele is the first reference outside the Bible to the name of Israel. And I wanted to see this and study it. Of course, there's pictures of it. It's very well documented.
Yeah, which if you minimalize the presence of Israel in Egypt, of the Jewish nation, actually, in so many senses, you could actually say being birthed out of Egypt, you've really undermined the entire beginning story of the Jewish nation, right?
Well, and that goes back to the whole, conflict, of Israel's right to exist as a nation.
Exactly.
And so people who, don't agree with that, they say that Israel's history has been made up. And so any evidence to the contrary, they don't like to bring to light. And so this is one of those artifacts.
This and arguably a huge piece of that puzzle.
Well, it is, and that's why I wanted to see it. And basically they said, "I'm sorry, sir, you can't see the artifact." I said, "Well, why not?" And they said, "Well, it's in our basement." I said, "It's in your basement?" They said, "Yes, but we can't take you down there." And I said, "Well,
that was your first question. Why is one of the biggest evidences stored in your basement and not out on display for everyone to see and study?"
Well, they have more things in the basement at the Cairo Museum and the Smithsonian in the U.S. than you'll ever see up top.
Well, yeah, I know, but I mean, we're not talking about some obscure piece of history. I mean, this is a huge piece of ancient history.
Well, that's right. And the man that I was talking to he was very kind, but he said, "Sir, I've worked at the museum now for over 3 years, and I've never been able to see the artifact."
Wow.
So it just, and that's just one example, but the truth is out there, and that's what I do. I search for the truth, and of course that's, one of the, basic concepts of life. What is truth? Pilate asked Christ, "What is truth?" And, we really need to define what truth is. It's really a verified or indisputable fact.
Yes.
Basically, it's the direct opposite of falsehood.
Yes.
And to suppress truth is to resist it, truth consciously. It's basically not a disbelief of the truth, but it's a denial of the truth, you see. So there's a world of difference between the ignorance of the truth and the denial of the truth.
That's absolutely correct. That's actually where I got the name for this show, What is Truth Radio Show, was from Pilate's question, because I thought out of every question that's ever been asked on planet Earth, that's probably the most profound question that's ever been asked. What is truth? When he asked the Lord that, and so that's why I've ended up calling it that, because I'm a firm believer in the search for the truth and in the examination of all sides.
Well, the existence of God and the laws of nature do not have to be proven. Matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson, in his writing of the Declaration, really paraphrased from Romans, and he called them self-evident truths.
Yes.
They're self-evident, which means that it's obvious. There's no need to prove it because it's obvious. And so those who really suppress the truth are engaging in self-deception, and that's part of what Dr. Bergman was talking about. It's a practice of self-deception that's entwined into the halls of academia. But the Bible is very clear when it talks about truth. in Galatians it says that that the truth of the gospel might be continue with you.
Yes.
In John it says, by grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. So it gives us the definition, a biblical definition of what truth is.
Yes.
And it's very important to understand that.
When you were at the museum in Cairo, did you try and go to a supervisor or something like that? Did you try and get any further answers, or did you just kind of let it go at that point and walk away shaking your head going, I can't believe one of the most important artifacts in Jewish history, if you will, is in the basement of the museum, and I can't see it, nor can anybody else?
Well, I did ask, and they stonewall you, and so there's really, once you get a very obvious no, they're not going to let you, especially in a different country. You don't push really hard.
Yeah.
But those things, are very obvious to the archaeologists who study these things, but they don't show it to the general public. And that's the problem that I have, is that the general public doesn't know the truth. They're not being told what they're not being told. They're not being told that there's evidences out there in archaeology. There's evidences in other fields for things that, it may be, intelligent design, for example. Yeah. Or it could be, Israel and Egypt.
Let's jump over to another one, and it was Malachite Man, and I asked you about Malachite Man because when I first started studying Dinosaur Monument National Park and the discovery of Malachite Man and the family that was there, you told me you actually had some experience digging at that site. And then you told me some very shocking things afterwards. I don't know why I get shocked anymore the more I study, but I still do. I still get shocked at it. But what happened with the Malachite Man's evidence?
Well, the Malachite site is an area that basically is the skeletal remains of about 10 women, men, and children that were buried very rapidly. In other words, it wasn't a ceremonial burial. They were all buried very quickly. Uh-huh. And these skeletons of these in situ skeletons basically are down in the layer in the Dakota sandstone about 50 feet. And this is in the formation of the Lower Cretaceous that's supposedly 140 million years old at Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. And I excavated at that site along with some colleagues in 1998. And we recovered some of the skeletons and the bones. It's called Malachite Man because the bones have turned a turquoise green. It's the mineral malachite that has leached into the bone and turned all these bones green.
Beautiful, actually.
And so it's very pretty color. It's the same mineral that you find along in turquoise. Uh-huh. And but back in the 70s, the original landowner had discovered an intact human skull, mandible, maxillary, full row of teeth, and the whole skull was a beautiful green, malachite green color. Uh-huh. And he basically, the Smithsonian came out, looked at it. He had called, and the skull was taken to the Smithsonian for further study, and it was never seen again. The skull was never returned to the landowner. Matter of fact, there's been another skull that was found since then, and the landowner didn't want to call the Smithsonian, so he took it out, and he said he reburied it in a different location. We haven't been able to find that. We've found other remains, but under the Freedom of Information Act and some other things, we've tried to get the Smithsonian to simply allow us to look at the skull, just to photograph it, not to take it from the property, but just simply to acknowledge the presence and to photograph it for study. And they will not let you do that. Matter of fact,
Do they admit to having it?
They don't admit to having it at all.
What do they say?
Well, they just deny the presence of the artifact altogether.
Was there photos? Was there photo documents of it when he found it?
Well, the landowner had taken photographs, and the Smithsonian originally came out and took photographs, but then they took the artifact altogether.
Along with the photographs that the landowner
along
took?
With their photographs. Now, the landowner had a eyewitness testimony to these events, and he recorded his story down as well.
Yeah.
But this is not unusual for these artifacts that don't fit in the mainstream paradigm of evolution or Darwinian theory to simply disappear or vanish.
Why did the Malachite skull not fit into the mainstream evolutionary theory? What was unique about the location that it was found?
Well, it's unique because it's down in an area in the lower Cretaceous of the Dakota Sandstone that is in the same layer of dinosaurs. And so basically you have human remains in situ in the same layer of dinosaurs from the dinosaurs at Vernell, Utah, at the Dinosaur National Monument, and they don't know how to explain it. Because it should be evolution.
It should be millions of years in layers above the dinosaur fossils.
Well, and they can't
is that what you're saying?
Because they are not willing to push man back, 60 million years or 100 million years. They can't, because it totally destroys their own theory. The only thing they can say, the only logical conclusion, is that man had to have lived and seen with dinosaurs. Now that blows people away. It blew my mind away because I was never taught anything like this, never heard anything about this. But as I began to study other areas, I began to learn of these evidences, what I like to call the creation X-Files.
Uh-huh.
And the suppression of truth is immense throughout all fields of science.
That's actually a good segue into the third area that I wanted to ask you about before we move on. And this is kind of a show teaser for next week. And that is, I remember when we were standing down at the Paluxy Riverbed, you were talking to me about the DNR who would bring people down through the park, and people would ask, where are the sets of human footprints? And the answer that was given, could you replay that story for me about the park rangers?
Well, when
this was years ago, but
what I think you're talking about is Glenrose is pretty famous for the footprints in the limestone on the Paluxy River.
Yes.
And back in the early days, it was very well known that there were dinosaur tracks and human tracks in the riverbed. Now that's more of a topic that we're going to talk about next week.
Yeah, we're going to dig deep into that next week.
But in the 1970s and 80s, what is now known as the state park locale had signs pointing to dinosaur tracks, and they had signs pointing to the human tracks.
You're kidding.
And the public would be able to go, and the residents in Glenrose and the old-timers have testimony to this. There is photographic evidence of it. Matter of fact, I knew one of the park rangers at the state park. When I asked what happened to those signs, he said, yeah, they made us take them all up, and we got them all in storage now. Huh. Why did they put those signs up? Because they were really, what they were doing unknowingly is advocating dinosaurs and humans together.
Yeah.
And they made them pull up those signs about the human footprints. And so the suppression of truth is evident throughout all fields of science, whether it's geology, paleontology. You can find it in every field of academia.
Wow. And that's definitely something we're going to dig into next week. And then a very good friend of yours the following week after that is Joe Taylor, who you told me he's got direct involvement with the relief that was found on, I can't remember which one you were talking about, but it was at Arches, maybe? Arches National Park, and there was a pictograph, if you will, of humans and dinosaurs, and they were trying to say, well, that's not a dinosaur, and explain it away, and Joe had some involvement on that.
Yes, that's one of the dinosaur pictographs. They're in Utah, and it basically, and Joe will be able to elaborate on this, but it basically is in the time of the Fremont Indians. They had a pictograph on the wall depicting an Indian warrior next to a sauropod-type dinosaur. And that's very intriguing because this pictograph, although it is a very unique pictograph representing all the desert varnish showing authenticity, it isn't isolated. There's others like it all around.
Wow.
Depicting the fact that man and dinosaur lived contemporaneously. And to have the suppression of truth go unchallenged really permits the truth to be twisted into a lie because of the lack of responsibility by the people who know.
Yes.
And basically, lies become truth, and truth becomes lies.
Yeah. And
they're only lies if they go unchallenged.
Exactly.
And that is really where we're at in America. Is we have recover and we have let's rebuild and let's reclaim. I think we really need to be thinking about repent.
Reclaiming the truth so we can repent.
Reclaiming the truth and turn back to repentance. We must speak the truth. We have to demand the truth.
Yes.
People should expect the truth. People should teach the truth, and people should live the truth.
Yes.
And instead of joining the suppression of truth, it's time that we really stand up and defend it.
Well, that's a perfect segue back over to you, Jerry. You mind if I call you Jerry?
No problem.
Okay. It's actually a perfect segue back over to you, Jerry, because, while I was looking into all this, it another thing that I study end days prophecy a lot too. And in my studies, I've realized, I'm sitting here looking right now at what's happening over in the Middle East and specifically Israel. And I'm saying, I'm following it, but I'm having a hard time putting my finger on who's going to make the first move. And if I was forced into a corner and said, what is your opinion now? I would say, well, Israel's going to make the first move because Israel's going to be the one who is the bully. They always have been labeled as a bully when it comes to the Palestinians and the land over there, and so that's kind of my answer. But it got me really thinking: how do we get into this position where Israel is the bullies? And in this suppression of truth, I was really reminded of Ahmadinejad and his denial of the Holocaust. And here's just a few key claims of the Holocaust deniers. They say the Nazis had no official policy or intention of exterminating Jews. They did not use gas chambers to murder the Jews. The figure of 5 to 6 million Jewish deaths is a gross exaggeration, and the actual number is an order of magnitude lower. This is off of a Holocaust denial website, just for the sake of time, because we actually have Jerry with us to speak to that a little bit as far as how did they get there. The first idea is that it was Hitler's idea, and I'll just read just a small section. It says Germany was vulnerable. They had just lost the war. They had debts to pay back, and they needed a scapegoat. So Hitler came along and made himself seem like a hero to the German people. His hatred for the Jews was founded on no logical grounds that can be proven, so one can only assume that he did not hate the Jews. Quite the opposite. He sympathized with them. He simply manipulated the desperate German public. He gave them a reason to keep living. He gave them what they wanted, a scapegoat. It's true. Hitler could have used the communists as a scapegoat, and he did for a while. It was it just wasn't as popular for the Germans for some reason, but using a race against a race seems more logical, and it was probably far more logical to Hitler as well, considering he sympathized with the Jews. Maybe something good can come out of it.
Well, the problem with all those ideas is that the World War II did not end that long ago, and I knew a number of people who were in the concentration camps, who were in Nazi Germany at that time, and I've talked to them about what they saw. And the other thing is, which is kind of interesting, is that the Nazis and Germans as a whole, the cultural background is such where they kept incredible records. And so, therefore, we have enormous records. We not only know how many died, but we know the names of most of those that died.
Well, that's the number two. On the Holocaust denial websites, number two is it's the Jews' idea. And just real briefly, it says, starting in 1904, the Jews began circulating rumors that they were all being killed. By 1945, the Jews had forged tens of thousands of Nazi documents, all proving that the Nazis had committed mass murder. The Jews invented the whole thing in a whirlwind effort. They invented the places where the gassings took place. They forged photographs. They forged reports. They forged inventories at the morgues. This is all what people actually believe. And Ahmadinejad, I'm gonna stop after this and get into why this is relevant to our conversation tonight. Ahmadinejad, it was on the Associated Press, they put out a thing that said Iran President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was proud of the Holocaust denial. And here's what he said on September 18th of 2009. They, the Western powers, launched the myth of the Holocaust. They lied, they put on a show, and then they support the Jews. If as you claim the Holocaust is true, why can a study not be allowed? And that Dr. Bergman, that is just ridiculous, because as you said, it wasn't that long ago. The pretext for establishing the Zionist regime is a lie which relies on an unreliable claim, a mythical claim, and the occupation of Palestine has nothing to do with the Holocaust. The claim is corrupt and the pretext is corrupt. The Israeli regime days are numbered and it is on its way to collapse. The regime is dying. Now, Dr. Bergman, that's why I can't believe your book is about to talk about what I'm just talking about. You know, there's another suppression of the truth. And how is Israel going to be painted as the bad guy? They never suffered in the first place. They've always been the bad guy. They've always been the ones who are in control. They've always run it. That's the lie that's out there. The truth of the Holocaust. When I watched that movie,
Expelled.
No, 180. Have you seen that?
Oh,
Jared?
180. Oh, yeah.
Oh, my goodness. If you haven't seen 180, the movie, go and watch it. If you stop listening to the show right now and go and watch it, it's the best thing you'll ever do, but hopefully you'll wait till the end of the show. But go watch it. But in the beginning of that, he said he was comparing the Holocaust, trying to get people. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody remembered the Holocaust. Nobody knew what the Holocaust was. Nobody knew who the Nazis were. Nobody knew who Hitler was. And I'm sitting here going, this is impossible that people don't know this. But as I really started thinking about it, the Holocaust has been one of those things that the truth of the Holocaust has been suppressed for years. But why it's relevant tonight to our topic is this. What's the whole point in the intelligent design being suppressed? What's the whole point of creationism being suppressed? Let's just go as far as to say anything related to God, Christianity, Jesus Christ, the truth. Why is it important that if that gets suppressed, there's some, because in the evolutionist's own words, if there is no God, there is no creation. If there is no creation, there is no end afterwards. There's no life after death. And if there's no life after death, then there's no real point to life. And if there's no point to life, there's no moral objectives. And if there's no moral objectives, then carpe diem. Live every day as though it's your last and you have nothing to answer to. Well, that's dangerous because while not every evolutionist is going to turn into Hitler, please do not mistake what I'm about to say. Hitler's position could not have been possible had it not been for the evolutionary model. Dr. Bergman, could you emphasize, could you expand on what that means?
Oh, yeah, you're right in what you're saying there, and there's an enormous amount of evidence we have, especially the Germans have done a very good job documenting their own history, and of course they have access to their own records so they can do a better job. But also I find many German historians who are living in Germany are very, very honest about their history and about what happened and why, and they've very carefully documented. So if you're talking about forgeries, you're talking about a massive forgery involving millions of people. In fact, I don't know any, and I've read quite a bit about this, and I don't know anybody who disagrees with what I'm saying, who's a reputable historian. Now, the Holocaust deniers do, but then that's a very small number of people.
Yeah.
Typically, they're not very informed about the German history, and typically also the claims they make are outlandish. I knew one Holocaust denier fairly well, Dietlib Fielder, and he, I think, was deceived, and he gets into these ideas, and he pushes them and pushes them. And I think he means well, but in this case, I think he was clearly deceived, and I tried to tell him that, but he didn't seem to accept what I was trying to say. But that's part of the problem. They have a belief, and once they have a belief the Holocaust never occurred, it's very hard to change those beliefs. Yeah. And you can go on and on with all kinds of evidence and what the history books have to say and what all reputable historians have to say without exception. And as a result, you end up with people who just won't accept what's going on. And so that's an impediment. They call those the glasses. They got a pair of glasses on that won't let them see reality. And this is one of many examples. It's true with evolution as well. They simply, evolutionists have the evolution glasses on, and they simply won't see reality. Yeah. They don't want to see it. And so many people prevent them from seeing it because books are censored, books are not put in libraries, which point out to the other side. And that's a big problem.
Well, talk about the leaders within Hitler's regime, and what I've always said is Hitler based his whole entire theory of ruling off of an evolutionary model that the lesser life forms must die. That's part of the, it's part of the survival of the fittest mentality of evolutionary models, so that he was just trying to do that. I was watching on Ben Stein's movie where he went to a place where it wasn't just the Jews, it was handicapped people, retarded people, gay people, people who didn't fit the model of the Aryan race, that the perfect race that his evolutionary model should have fit into. Do you think that evolution, the theory of evolution, had a huge part to play in Hitler's governing?
There's no question. There's a 2-hour film, 4 hours, I think, total film called Nazi Scientists, and excellent film, and interviews leading historians, as well as shows a lot of photographs taken during the Nazi era, which well documents indeed how central, and the movie makes it very, very clear how central Nazism, Darwinism was to Nazism, and you simply can't deny it. And again, there's an enormous amount of material out there which well documented indeed what took place and why. And when you look at, as I said, the German Nazi leaders like Heinrich Himmler, for example, Goebbels, another example, Joseph Goebbels, and on down the line, and all these leading Nazi leaders clearly were enamored by Darwinism, and clearly were trying to produce a superior race, and made this very abundantly clear in their writing. Some of them kept diaries, so we can consult the diaries. Others had sent memos, various memos to other individuals, and so we know pretty much what happened and why it happened.
And that's the danger of the suppression of the truth, is as Aaron kind of mentioned, truth is a person. It's in the person of Jesus Christ. It's the foundation of which we decide right from wrong. Right. when I'm witnessing to people, sometimes I'll kind of use the questions approach and just ask them, what's right and wrong? How do you determine that? And who do you hold yourself up against somebody else? Or when we start doing that, everybody's always got a superior to them who's better than they are, and everybody's always got somebody lesser than them who's worse than they are. So how do we know? You get caught in this vicious cycle of trying to figure out right from wrong. But when you juxtapose right from wrong against the person of Christ, the character of God himself, that's how you determine it. And when we begin to suppress the truth, what happens is somebody like Hitler can come up to the plate and use the actual evolutionary model, and people don't understand this. He's using the evolutionary model to exterminate people. That's dangerous.
Obviously dangerous. It's the loss of about 11 million lives directly because of this idea, as well as the loss of, they estimate 80 million people lost their lives in World War II. And a lot of historians have said if Hitler only would have concentrated on his other goals, would have not held the idea that the Jews were inferior and related, there's a much better chance that he would have won World War II. Yeah. And would have not had nearly the opposition. I think a good example is when troops moved into Ukraine, they welcomed the Nazis as liberators because they felt the Germans must be better than the Russians. And so they welcomed the Nazis as liberators. But then when the Nazis started to kill the so-called inferior people there, then, of course, they switched sides. Yeah. And they realized that, no, we're better off under the Russians than we are under the Nazis.
And by that point,
so they had a lot of support they lost simply because of this racist ideology that they had. Yeah. They wouldn't have had that, I think, a lot of countries, as Austria did, and as Ukraine and other countries did, would have said, fine, let's, become part of the German Empire. We have no problems.
Yeah.
If they would have treated people well. But they didn't because of the idea that certain races were inferior, which was not just the Jews, but also, importantly, the Slavics.
Of the natural selection process. I mean, it's the survival of the fittest mentality.
Dave, this goes back to the root problem in the world. It's not just a political one, but it's a spiritual one.
Yeah.
We're a rebellious people under the control of a rebellious system controlled by rebellious leaders.
Yeah.
And the problem is, in America, is that, that the godless are not acting according to their nature, but it's that the Christians are not acting like theirs.
Yes.
We're not acting according to our nature, and that is to stand up for the truth. It says, one of my favorite verses in Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And then it goes on to say that the invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse.
Yeah.
That is the end.
Yes.
They are held without excuse. We are held without excuse.
That's right.
If all we had was the creation to look at, we are still held without excuse. And I think that is a very powerful statement. And
I think that's why it's very important that we, as a Christian union, need to come together and begin to just stand up for the biblical truths that are found within the Bible and stop being pushed around, stop being persuaded by empty promises, stop being persuaded by the loss of a position. If you're a Christian Scientist and you're worried about your career, then you've got your objectives are wrong in the first place. God is the provider of your career, always has been, always will be. And the risk you're taking by not standing up to the truth that you're finding in your research is far greater than the risk that you're going to have by walking out God's will for your life. Well, we got to cut it short and or cut it to an end. We're coming up on the 7 o'clock mark. Dr. Bergman, Dr. Judkins, I cannot thank you enough for standing up with us tonight and going into the suppression of truth, what that means, and I cannot wait for next week to really get into this. So you've been listening to What is Truth with Dave Glander on WIMO 1300.